Hello, this is Tim, and yesterday I made a very brief video about HSBC, and as a result of that I've been doing some research and I'm disturbed by what I find. Now I realise I've been trying to draw the chief executive of HSBC, a man called Noel Quinn, and I realise I think I've done that, I've drawn him before. But I'm going to continue drawing him. So here he is on the board behind me. Now, HSBC, under its chief executive Noel Quinn, has been seeing a sharp decline in profits over this last year and a shrink in the money that is available to its executives and shareholders and so on in its bonus pot. Now, why is this? It's partly because of the pandemic, of course, but it's also partly because of the banking crisis from a few years ago and the restructuring of the bank that followed, as well as some fairly tight laws which have been imposed on HSBC in particular, God knows why. But in addition, we got low interest rates, which mean, for example, that Quinn, in order to try and maximise the few profits he's got available, he announced plans to scrap free banking to the majority of personal customers. So confirming this comment which was made to the video that I made yesterday, that HSBC is not interested in personal banking. It's only interested in corporate banking. Well, that may well be true. But there's a much bigger issue, and that bigger issue is about HSBC's relationship to China, and it's rather bizarre behaviour. Now, we know that China, and specifically Hong Kong, there's a problem in Hong Kong, and the Chinese authorities have been cracking down on pro-democracy movements. And HSBC has failed to stand up against the controversial laws that have riddled Hong Kong in what is actually the 180th year since the city was set up. And HSBC sees a lot of its work, a lot of its money is generated in Hong Kong. Now, to its credit, HSBC has made a commitment on paper to support human rights. And in fact, Noel Quinn is on record in one or two interviews, and one interview actually online, which you can find, talking about his commitment to diversity. But at the same time, HSBC has publicly supported China's new security law, and therefore the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. Now, it's not only publicly supported, it's followed that through with action. It's frozen the accounts, it's frozen the assets of pro-democracy activists like, for example, Ted Hui, who was attacked by the Chinese authorities for being unpatriotic. And he now lives in exile in Denmark, seeking political exile here in the UK. Mr. Hui wrote directly to the chief executive of HSBC to ask why his accounts had been frozen and why his bank, HSBC, had been party to what he called oppressing freedom. Why was HSBC oppressing freedom? What had Mr. Hui done that was against banking rules? Nothing. So far, the British government has failed to fully challenge Mr. Quinn, though the British government have called him in to explain himself in some form. Mr. Quinn, in turn, stands by his statement that he was complying with a police request in Hong Kong that followed what is described as a disruption in the legislative chamber in Hong Kong last year when the controversial security law was passed. Well, we've had disruptions in the chamber in Britain, and I don't see that this means that parliamentarians' assets should be frozen. The Speaker of the House throws the parliamentarian, the MP, out of the House for the day. That's it. Mr. Hui is on record saying that Quinn, the chief executive of HSBC, failed to provide the legal basis for the suspension of his account and asset freeze. And not only the suspension of his account, but the suspension of the accounts of his whole family. In other words, HSBC has acted a little bit like a state government. I find this very worrying, particularly when, as I read around, it turns out that HSBC quite routinely freezes people's accounts. About 4 or 5 months ago, it froze my account. And then I had to go into HSBC and plead, and I spoke to the rather lovely deputy managers in my own branch, and they made sure the account was unfrozen. But it wasted a lot of time. And why had it happened, and why wasn't I told? My account was actually frozen for quite some time because I hadn't actually bothered to look at it. I just assumed things were happening. Things weren't. So no correspondence was entered into before that happened with me, and presumably the same thing with Mr. Hui. So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a bank which behaves like a state. Actually more like less like a state, which behaves like God. So I don't know quite what Mr. Quinn's role is in this divine function. On the subject of divinity, there's also a church in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Church, which also incidentally was linked to helping pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. It apparently has also had its own accounts frozen by the HSBC, and this puts in jeopardy the church's support specifically for homeless shelters around Hong Kong. Mr. Hui said that he'd not been questioned about his account, but it had simply been frozen. He said, and I quote, that he had found, he said, had the bank found his account suspicious, or had it suspended his account because the Chinese police said so. Was this financial or was this political because of the new security law? HSBC makes most of its money in Hong Kong and China, but its headquarters are based in London. So it may be headquartered in London, but its eyes are clearly on keeping the Chinese government happy. Now, is this appropriate? HSBC has provided no reasonable explanation to Mr. Hui, except to say, quote, it is extremely disappointed that the facts have been distorted. But of course facts are distorted or misrepresented or different to the facts that you think they are if we don't know what you think the facts are. If you maintain a silence as a bank and you don't communicate to your customers, of course, there's going to be a distortion in what we believe. That distortion may incidentally also be correct. It may just not be the information you want to put out. Quinn has continued to maintain a policy of no comment as the Beijing laws have rammed through the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, and newspapers have folded, and citizens who were promised liberty in the Chinese handover, in the handover that Britain made to China under Chris Patten. They were promised liberty, and yet they have been imprisoned. So I find this very worrying, and I find I hadn't put two and two together. Now I'm putting two and two together, and what I am discovering is something that stinks, actually. I'm discovering silence, no comment, and at the same time a lot of disquiet. And I'm discovering that our government is not really trying to get the answers. So not only is HSBC pandering to a foreign government, it's also not explaining itself because our government is not pressing sufficiently hard. I find this very, very worrying. The China issue is not the only issue that seems to me to be threatening HSBC, because HSBC should also be, and probably is also being targeted by climate change activists who argue that HSBC is one of the largest financiers of fossil fuels. So what are we looking at the moment? So when I place my concerns about HSBC in this broader context, what am I looking at? I'm looking at a bank that will not explain what it's doing, that acts oddly, from my point of view, irrationally and unpredictably, that I cannot trust. But yet at the same time, it's not trustworthy in any sort of global sense. It will not explain itself globally. It will not explain itself to power, to governments. It may be based in the UK, but it seems particularly beholden to China, to a government that is behaving appallingly to its own people, and that is flagrantly defying the British agreement in place when we handed over sovereignty of Hong Kong. That ceremony with Prince Charles, that ceremony with Chris Patten. Pointless. Pointless. And made more pointless by the toadying of a disreputable organisation like HSBC. Now, I'm sure we'll have more to say over the next few days, but in the meantime, it just suddenly struck me, HSBC, I know it's an acronym that has a perfectly valid meaning, but I thought it might be entertaining to see if in the comments you might find some more apposite words to describe HSBC. What do you think the acronym HSBC should stand for, given the way that HSBC is currently behaving? I've certainly got a few ideas in mind that I may share in my next video, but there we are. So in the meantime, I finished drawing Noah Quinn now, and I hope I've done him justice. So he may not have testified fully about what he's doing in HSBC. But there he is. He's there at hand for us to gaze at least, and look at, and wonder at. Why is he so silent? Why is he not doing his job? Why is this bank so discreditable, so untrustworthy? And why should we think very carefully before we put our money there? As I said yesterday, I'm certainly thinking very seriously about whether my money is safe with this man. But there we are. Anyway, look, please, by all means, follow me and ring the bell. It's down there somewhere. It's somewhere down there. And I look forward to hearing your comments and also your version of what you think the acronym HSBC should stand for. Have fun. Bye-bye.